A black businesswoman, fresh from delivering a keynote address at an international conference, was prepared to board her private jet and head home. But when she reached the terminal, everything shifted. A flight crew member denied her boarding, dismissing her credentials and embarrassing her in front of the staff. Just 10 minutes later, her response left everyone speechless and initiated a ripple effect that no one could have anticipated. What happened next showcased the quiet strength of standing firm against bias. Stay with me. This is a story you won't want to overlook. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're joining us from, and if this tale inspires you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more moments of resilience and justice. In the radiant light of the private airport terminal, Ophelia Harris, a successful entrepreneur, prepared to board her jet. Her tailored navy blazer and understated pearls conveyed quiet confidence. Ophelia's presence was a testament to her perseverance, a journey marked by overcoming countless obstacles. The airport buzzed with the activity of executives and wealthy travelers. She approached the counter with her flight details, but the cool gaze of the attendant hinted at the challenges to come. The morning sun cast its golden hue across the polished floors of the terminal, its light refracting through the gleaming windows. It was a space designed for comfort, a sanctuary for the privileged. Soft leather chairs, the faint scent of fresh coffee, and the low murmur of distant conversations created an atmosphere of exclusivity that Ophelia Harris had come to recognize but never truly belonged to, at least in the eyes of others. She adjusted her pearl earrings, a habit she had developed over the years to steady herself before entering places where assumptions were made before introductions. At 62, Ophelia had earned every bit of her success. She wasn't just an entrepreneur, she was a trailblazer. Yet no tailored blazer, no perfectly styled hair, no shining accolade pinned to her name seemed to shield her from the gaze that followed her. Now, a subtle narrowing of eyes, a flicker of disbelief. Ophelia approached the counter with measured steps, the quiet click of her heels, an unspoken declaration of her right to be there. The attendant, a young woman with a practiced smile, barely glanced up as she greeted her. "Good morning, ma'am. Name and flight details, please." "Ophelia Harris, private flight to Chicago," she replied, her tone calm but deliberate, the kind that indicated someone used to being second-guessed. The attendant's fingers danced across the keyboard. The pause that followed was subtle but revealing. Her eyes flicked to Ophelia, her polite smile faltering just a bit before she nodded. "Yes, Miss Harris, the flight is ready. Would you like to wait in the lounge or board now?" Quote, "I'll board now, thank you." Ophelia's smile was small but resolute as she gathered her bag and moved toward the gate. She could feel the weight of eyes on her back, not hostile but inquisitive, as though her very presence needed justification. It was the kind of scrutiny that had followed her all her life, one that whispered, "Are you sure you belong here?" As she neared the gleaming jet, her jet, another figure appeared. This one, larger and more imposing, Captain Mitchell Green stood at the bottom of the steps, his posture rigid, his expression impassive but cold. His uniform was immaculate. His polished shoes reflected the sunlight like mirrors. "Can I assist you, ma'am?" he asked, his tone clipped, his eyes scanning her like an item needing appraisal. Ophelia stopped, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm here for the flight to Chicago." His brow furrowed, and a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "This is a private flight," he said slowly, as though explaining a complicated concept to a child. "I know," she replied, her voice steady. "It's my flight." The smirk deepened, his eyes sweeping over her tailored blazer, her designer suitcase, and landing pointedly on her skin. "Right," he said, folding his arms, "and I'm the president." Ophelia felt her grip tighten on her bag, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch between them, her composure unbroken. "I'll need to see some documentation," he added, the smirk fading into something more guarded. Before Ophelia could respond, another figure appeared, a flight attendant named Aaron, clipboard in hand. She glanced at Ophelia, her smile polite but her eyes filled with doubt. "Is there a problem, Captain?" "She claims this is her flight," Green said, the skepticism in his voice thick enough to cut. Without a word, Ophelia retrieved her phone, tapping a few times before holding it out. The email was clear, her name, the flight number, the destination. Aaron's eyes widened slightly as she read it, her face paling. "It's all in order," she said softly, handing the phone back. Green's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside reluctantly. "Welcome aboard," he muttered, though the words carried none of the warmth they implied. As Ophelia ascended the steps of her own jet, she felt the tension hanging in the air behind her like a storm cloud. This was not new. This was not extraordinary. This was the daily, grinding weight of being questioned in spaces where she belonged, a fight for dignity in a world eager to strip it away. Inside the jet, she set her bag down and took a seat, her expression unreadable. She had won this round, but the game itself was far from over. The quiet luxury of the jet surrounded her. But it could not drown out the faint hum of something darker, something pervasive. The day was only just beginning. The cabin of the jet exuded a quiet opulence. Its cream-colored leather seats and dark walnut accents, a reflection of Ophelia Harris's hard-won success. Yet as she settled into her seat, the air was thick with a discomfort she could not ignore. The tension from the interaction with Captain Green lingered, a quiet reminder that no amount of achievement could insulate her from the unspoken hierarchies woven into everyday life. The young flight attendant Erin approached hesitantly, her hands clasped tightly around the clipboard, her smile brittle, a thin mask of professionalism stretched over something less pleasant. "Would you like a drink before takeoff, Miss Harris?" she asked. "Water, please," Ophelia replied, her tone polite but measured. Erin nodded and turned, but her steps faltered as Captain Green entered the cabin, his presence a sharp intrusion into the space. His eyes flickered briefly to Ophelia before settling on Erin. "Step outside with me for a moment," he said to her, his voice low but firm. Erin glanced at Ophelia, then back at the captain, her unease visible. She followed him out, the cabin door hissing softly as it sealed behind them. Ophelia leaned back in her seat, her hands resting lightly on her lap. But her mind was restless. She had been in this position too many times before, the subject of whispered conferences, her competence or legitimacy debated just out of earshot. It was not the overt slurs or shouted insults that wore a person down. It was this: the constant questioning, the quiet erosion of dignity by 1,000 unspoken doubts. Minutes stretched uncomfortably long before Erin returned, her face pale and her movements stiff. She placed a glass of water on the tray table with a faint clink, avoiding eye contact as she murmured, "Let me know if you need anything else." Ophelia watched her retreat, her own expression unreadable. She did not need to hear the conversation to understand its gist. Green's attitude had been clear enough, and Erin's uncertainty reflected the unspoken calculations she had undoubtedly been forced to make, whether to align herself with authority or to stand on principle. The engines hummed to life, and the jet began its taxi down the runway. Ophelia closed her eyes briefly, focusing on her breath, on the steady rhythm that grounded her. This flight was more than a journey to Chicago. It was another battle in an endless series of small, silent wars. As the plane lifted into the sky, Green emerged from the cockpit again, this time accompanied by another crew member, a younger attendant named Laura. Laura's expression was wary, her gaze flickering between the captain and Ophelia. "Dr. Harris," Green began, the words clipped as though forced from his mouth. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding earlier. I want to assure you it won't happen again." Quote, dot. Ophelia raised an eyebrow, her silence compelling him to continue. "This flight is typically reserved for corporate executives," he added, his tone bordering on condescension despite the apology. "I am a corporate executive," she replied calmly. "Yes, of course," he said quickly, the faintest hint of a flush rising to his cheeks. "But as you can imagine, we have protocols in place to ensure the integrity of our operations." Quote, dot. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "And those protocols include questioning the passengers who own the jet?" Laura shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Green, whose jaw tightened. "There's no need to take this personally, Dr. Harris," he said finally, the words clipped and defensive. Ophelia smiled faintly, though it did not reach her eyes. "What you see as protocol, Captain, I see as an assumption now. And assumptions are always personal, especially when they seem to follow certain patterns." Quote, dot. Green opened his mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. He nodded curtly and stepped back toward the cockpit, His authority diminished but not entirely subdued. Laura lingered for a moment as though she wanted to say something, but she too retreated. Ophelia sat back, her expression serene, but her sharpness evident. This was the second challenge of the day, and the plane had barely left the ground. The tension was subtle but pervasive, a quiet reminder that the battle for dignity was never truly over. It had only shifted arenas. As the jet leveled out at cruising altitude, Ophelia turned her gaze to the window, watching the clouds roll past. For every moment of defiance, there would be another test, another subtle maneuver to undermine her presence. She had learned to meet these challenges with grace, but she was tired. Tired of the smallness of minds, tired of carrying the weight of assumptions she had never asked for. And yet she resolved she would not be the one to falter. Not today. The quiet hum of the jet engines filled the cabin, a sound meant to soothe and insulate its occupants from the chaos of the outside world. But for Ophelia Harris, the noise only deepened her awareness of the unspoken tensions within these luxurious walls. She was no stranger to the unmarked boundaries people imposed, boundaries that declared without words who was welcome and who was merely tolerated. Today was proving no different. Now, not long after the plane leveled out, the younger flight attendant Laura reappeared with a meal tray. Her hands trembled slightly as she set it down on the table in front of Ophelia. The tray was elegant, with fine china and a meticulously arranged salad, but Ophelia noticed something was missing. "Excuse me," Ophelia said, her tone even but firm. "Could I have the dressing for this?" Laura hesitated, her eyes darting toward the back of the cabin. "I'll check, ma'am," she said softly, before scurrying off. Minutes passed long enough for Ophelia to recognize the familiar rhythm of avoidance. She took a sip of water, waiting. When Laura returned, she was empty-handed. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she stammered. "We seem to have run out." Ophelia raised an eyebrow, her gaze steady. She had been on enough flights, indeed owned enough flights, to know that running out of something as basic as salad dressing was highly unlikely. But it wasn't the dressing that mattered. It was the lie, the quiet dismissal disguised as a logistical issue that echoed louder than any confrontation could. "That's unfortunate," Ophelia said, her voice calm but laced with meaning. "Perhaps next time the flight manifest can ensure that the owner of the jet is adequately accommodated." Laura flushed deeply and mumbled an apology before retreating again. Ophelia let the matter drop. She knew it was pointless to press further. The dressing wasn't the point. It was never the point. Halfway through the flight, Captain Green made another appearance, his tall frame filling the doorway to the cabin, and his forced smile did little to hide the tension etched into his features. "Dr. Harris," he began, his voice a touch too polite, "I wanted to personally apologize for the earlier misunderstanding." Ophelia folded her hands in her lap, watching him with the calm scrutiny of someone who had seen this performance many times before. She nodded slightly, inviting him to continue. "I assure you, we pride ourselves on providing a seamless experience for all of our passengers," he said, his words rehearsed, each one carefully chosen to avoid liability. "If there's anything we can do to make the remainder of your flight more comfortable, please let me know." It was a masterclass in surface-level contrition, the kind designed to soothe without addressing the deeper insult. Ophelia's smile was faint, almost imperceptible. "Thank you, Captain Green," she replied, "but what I require isn't comfort, it's respect, and that, I believe, is beyond your current protocols." His smile faltered for the briefest of moments, the mask slipping just enough for her to see the discomfort behind it. He nodded stiffly and stepped back toward the cockpit. As the flight neared its destination, the jet encountered turbulence, a sudden and sharp reminder of the uncontrollable forces at play. The passengers, few as they were, clutched their armrests as the plane jolted. Ophelia, however, remained calm, her eyes fixed on the view outside the window. She had weathered worse storms than this. When the turbulence subsided, Erin reappeared, her face pale. "Dr. Harris," she said, her voice quieter than before, "the captain wanted me to inform you that we may experience delays upon landing due to expected weather." Ophelia nodded, but said nothing. She knew there was more behind Erin's nervous demeanor than mere weather delays. These moments of friction, minor, almost invisible to the untrained eye, accumulated like drops of water eroding stone. They were designed to test her resolve, to see if she would bend or break under the weight of 1,000 small slights. But she would not. As the plane began its descent, Ophelia leaned back in her seat, her mind replaying the events of the day. Each moment, a missing salad dressing, a half-hearted apology, a strained explanation, was part of a larger mosaic, one that painted a picture of a society still struggling to reconcile its ideals with its realities. The lines dividing who was seen and who was invisible, who was respected and who was tolerated, were as clear to her now as they had been all her life. She knew the journey did not end when the wheels touched down. The real turbulence was not in the sky, but in the spaces where people refused to confront their own assumptions. And she, Ophelia Harris, would continue to push against those invisible lines, not for the sake of defiance, but for the dignity she knew was her right. The descent into Chicago was smooth, the skyline coming into view as the jet broke through the clouds. The towering buildings reflected the sunlight, a city bustling with life and ambition. But inside the cabin of Ophelia Harris's private jet, the atmosphere was anything but serene. Beneath the surface of polished professionalism and subdued luxury, tension rippled like an undercurrent, quiet but unmistakable. As the wheels touched down, Erin appeared once again, her demeanor more formal than it had been earlier. "Dr. Harris," she began, her voice measured, "we've arrived. We'll be taxiing to the private hangar shortly." Ophelia nodded, her gaze steady. "Thank you," she said simply, though the faintest edge in her voice hinted at her exhaustion. Not from the journey, but from the quiet battles fought along the way. The jet slowed to a stop, and the cabin doors opened to the crisp Chicago air. The ground crew bustled below, their movement efficient, while inside, Captain Green made his final appearance. He lingered at the doorway, his posture tense as though he were bracing himself for another confrontation. "Dr. Harris," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "I hope your flight was satisfactory." Ophelia met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of the silence settle before responding. "It was adequate," she said, her words carrying an unspoken message that adequate was a standard far below what she deserved. As Ophelia descended the steps of the jet, a black sedan waited for her on the tarmac. The driver, a young man named Marcus, stepped out to greet her, his demeanor warm and respectful. "Welcome to Chicago, Drive Harris," he said, opening the door for her. "Thank you, Marcus," she replied, her voice softening for the first time that day. She settled into the back seat, the familiar comfort of the car a brief respite from the subtle hostility she had endured. But the day's challenges were far from over. The drive to the Harper Holdings office was uneventful, the city's rhythm unfolding outside the car window. When they arrived, the building, a sleek modern structure that reflected her company's forward-thinking ethos, stood tall against the backdrop of the bustling streets. Ophelia stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement as she entered the lobby. The receptionist, a young woman named Claire, greeted her with the same practiced politeness Ophelia had encountered countless times before, but there was a flicker of hesitation as Claire's eyes darted between Ophelia and the screen in front of her. "Good morning, Drive Harris," she said, her tone slightly uncertain. "I didn't realize you'd be visiting today." "I prefer not to announce my arrivals," Ophelia replied, her smile fainted but pointed. "It keeps everyone on their toes." Claire nodded quickly, her cheeks flushing. "Of course. I'll notify Mr. Thompson that you're here." Ophelia made her way to the top floor, where the executive offices were housed. As she entered the boardroom, the low hum of conversations ceased abruptly. The room was filled with Harper Holdings executives, most of them older, most of them white. Their surprise at seeing her was palpable, though no one dared to voice it. She took her seat at the head of the table, her presence a stark contrast to the tension in the room. The meeting began, and as the agenda unfolded, Ophelia noticed the subtle ways her authority was questioned, a pointed remark about legacy leadership, a dismissive tone when discussing her strategic initiatives, a sideways glance that lingered just a beat too long. But it was when Robert, one of the senior executives, directly challenged her decision on an upcoming project that the undercurrent of doubt surfaced fully. "With all due respect, Dr. Harris," he said, his tone measured but condescending. "This initiative feels ambitious. Perhaps we should reconsider the timing." Ophelia tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp. "Ambitious or necessary?" she replied. "Perhaps you'd like to clarify." Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confidence faltering under her scrutiny. "I simply mean that we should proceed cautiously." "Caution is important," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But stagnation is not an option. This initiative is not just ambitious, it's critical, and it will proceed as planned." Her words settled over the room like a stone dropped into still water. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with the weight of unspoken tensions. Ophelia knew what they were thinking, knew how her presence disrupted their expectations. But she also knew that disruption was necessary. Change was never comfortable. As the meeting concluded, Ophelia lingered in the boardroom, letting the others leave before her. She stood by the window, looking out at the city below. The day had been filled with challenges, each one a reminder of the barriers that still existed, even at the highest levels of power. But Ophelia Harris had not built her empire by yielding to those barriers. She had built it by breaking them, one by one, with grace and determination. And she would continue to do so, not just for herself, but for the countless others who faced the same quiet, insidious challenges every day. She straightened her blazer and turned to leave the room, her steps purposeful. The fight was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. The corridors of Harper Holdings were lined with polished steel and glass, reflecting the sleek, modern ethos of the company Ophelia Harris had built. Yet even within these walls she had designed and funded, there lingered the faint but undeniable echoes of resistance. These echoes were not loud. They rarely were. Instead, they whispered in the form of polite dismissals, patronizing tones, and questions framed as concerns. After the board meeting, Ophelia returned to her office, a corner suite flooded with natural light, its walls adorned with framed awards, photographs of her family, and a few choice pieces of art that reflected her taste and heritage. She sat at her desk, her fingers poised over her laptop's keyboard, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Her assistant, Mara, knocked gently before entering. "Dr. Harris," she began, her tone carefully neutral. "Robert asked if you'd be available to discuss the new initiative further. He seems concerned about some of the numbers." Ophelia's lips tightened, but she forced a smile. "Thank you for the heads up, Mara. Schedule it for 4, but also remind him that the numbers have already been approved by the finance team." Mara nodded, but her hesitation didn't go unnoticed. Ophelia tilted her head slightly. "Something on your mind, Mara?" Mara's cheeks flushed. "It's just, I think Robert's trying to rally support to delay the project. I overheard him talking to some of the other executives earlier." Ophelia leaned back in her chair, her expression calm but her mind racing. This wasn't the first time she had faced internal opposition. She had fought for her position every step of the way. But the resistance always found new forms. Now it seemed it was cloaked in the guise of fiscal caution and strategic prudence. "Thank you for letting me know," Ophelia said. "That will be all for now." At 4 o'clock sharp, Robert arrived at her office. He was dressed impeccably, his demeanor polished, but Ophelia could see the calculation in his eyes. He began with pleasantries, commenting on the view from her window, but she cut him off gently. "You wanted to discuss the initiative," she prompted. "Yes," he said, leaning forward slightly. "I've been reviewing the projections again, and while the potential for growth is clear, I'm concerned about the timing. Launching this now could expose us to unnecessary risk." Ophelia nodded slowly, letting him speak, though her expression gave away nothing. When he finished, she leaned forward slightly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "And what do you believe will change in 6 months, Robert?" He hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of her question. "Well, the economic landscape is unpredictable." "It always is," she interrupted, her tone firm but not unkind. "But this initiative isn't about waiting for the perfect conditions. It's about creating them." You're worried about risk, but I see opportunity. Robert opened his mouth to respond, but she held up a hand. Let me be clear, she continued. This initiative has been thoroughly vetted. The data supports it, the market demands it, and our stakeholders expect it. Delaying it now would send the wrong message, internally and externally. We're not here to hesitate, Robert. We're here to lead. Quote, dot. Her words hung in the air, challenging not just Robert but everyone in the room. Now, she continued, her voice firm, if there are valid concerns about this initiative, new concerns, ones that haven't already been addressed, I'm willing to hear them. But if this is just another attempt to stall progress, let me assure you, it will not succeed. Quote, dot. Robert shifted in his seat, his confidence visibly shaken. The others exchanged uneasy glances, their hesitation speaking louder than words. Very well, he said finally, his tone subdued. Let's proceed as planned. Quote, dot. Ophelia nodded. Satisfied but not complacent. She knew this was just another battle in an ongoing war. That evening, as the office emptied and the city lights began to glow, Ophelia stayed behind, reviewing documents in the quiet of her office. The day's events played in her mind, each interaction a reminder of how the obstacles she faced were not overt but insidious, embedded in the very fabric of the spaces she occupied. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was a message from Marcus, her driver. Dr. Harris, I noticed some protesters gathering outside the building as I was parking. They don't seem violent, but I thought you should know. Quote, dot. Ophelia frowned. She stood and walked to the window, looking down at the street below. A small crowd had gathered, their signs indistinct from this distance, but the energy was clear. This, too, was familiar. Public scrutiny often followed her decisions, especially when they challenged the status quo. She had faced protests before, some fueled by genuine concerns, others by prejudice thinly veiled as opposition to corporate reach. She sighed, the weight of leadership pressing heavily on her shoulders. There was no escaping the scrutiny, no respite from the constant need to prove herself, but she would not retreat. The chapter closes, with Ophelia standing at the window, her reflection blending with the lights of the city below. Each challenge, whether in the boardroom or on the streets, was a reminder of the walls she had yet to tear down. And though those walls were built on assumptions and fears older than the city itself, she resolved to keep fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told, in words or in silence, that they did not belong. Night had settled over the city, but the lights of Harper Holdings offices burned brightly, a beacon of unyielding ambition. Ophelia Harris remained in her corner office, the hum of her computer, the only sound breaking the stillness. The day's challenges lingered in her mind like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. Outside, the protesters had grown in number, their chants rising faintly through the glass, a chorus of discontent. Though their words were still indistinct, Ophelia leaned back in her chair, her eyes heavy with fatigue, but her spirit sharp. This wasn't the first time she had been the focus of public scrutiny, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. Yet what unsettled her was not the protests themselves, but the realization of how deeply the threads of opposition wove into every corner of her life, subtle, persistent, and all too familiar. The phone on her desk buzzed. It was Mara. Dr. Harris, the security team would like to brief you on the situation outside. They're concerned it could escalate. Quote, dot. Ophelia paused for a moment before replying. Send them in. Moments later, 2 security officers entered, their expressions taut. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Davis, spoke first. Dr. Harris, we've been monitoring the crowd. So far it's peaceful, but we've noticed some individuals who seem agitated. It might be wise to leave through the back entrance tonight. Quote, dot. Ophelia regarded him calmly. And what message does that send? She asked, her voice measured. That, I'm afraid I can be intimidated. Davis hesitated, clearly uncertain how to respond. It's about safety, ma'am, he said finally. We don't want to take any chances. Quote, dot. I appreciate your concern, she replied, but I won't be sneaking out of my own building like a thief in the night. I'll leave as I always do, through the front. Quote, dot. The officers exchanged glances but nodded, their reluctance evident as they left. Ophelia turned back to the window, her reflection staring back at her. It was a small act of defiance, perhaps, But in a world that constantly sought to undermine her, even small acts mattered. The next morning brought a new challenge, one that was as insidious as it was predictable. An email arrived from Robert, marked urgent, requesting an unscheduled meeting with the board. The subject line read, "Revisiting the initiative." Ophelia read the email carefully, her lips pressing into a thin line. The tone was veiled, but the intent was clear. Another attempt to stall, to question her authority under the guise of prudence. She forwarded the email tomorrow with a simple instruction. Schedule it for noon. No delays. Quote, By noon, the boardroom was filled again. Robert sat at the far end of the table, flanked by a few allies whose expressions betrayed their alignment before they even spoke. Ophelia took her seat at the head, her posture unyielding. Robert began with a preamble, couching his objections in the language of fiscal responsibility and shareholder trust. He gestured to a series of charts projected on the screen, pointing out risks that had already been addressed in prior meetings. This isn't about questioning your leadership drive, Harris, he said, his tone tinged with condescension. It's about ensuring that we move forward in a way that protects the company's legacy. Quote, Ophelia's gaze bore into him, her patience wearing thin. No, Robert, she said, her voice unwavering. It's a leadership problem because we've allowed it to become one. And let me be clear. The public understands far more than you give them credit for. For what they see are the cracks we've ignored for too long. Quote, She stood, her presence commanding the room. We talk about diversity. We talk about inclusion. Too often, those words are just decorations on a mission statement. The reality is that people like me, people who don't fit the mold of what leadership is supposed to look like, are still fighting to prove we belong, even when we've earned our place 100 times over. Her words cut through the tension like a blade, exposing the unspoken truths that had lingered in the room for years. As the meeting continued, Ophelia outlined a plan not just to move the initiative forward, but to confront the deeper issues at the heart of the resistance. She proposed new systems of accountability, mandatory bias training, and greater transparency in decision-making processes. It was ambitious, even radical, but it was also necessary. This isn't just about protecting our brand, she said. It's about living up to the principles we claim to stand for. If we're not willing to do that, then what's the point? By the time the meeting adjourned, the room was buzzing with a mix of resistance and reluctant agreement. Ophelia knew the path forward wouldn't be easy, but she also knew it was the only way. As the executives filed out, she stayed behind, watching the city below through the large windows. The protesters were still there, their signs illuminated by the streetlights. But tonight, something felt different. The noise wasn't just a reminder of the challenges she faced. It was a testament to the power of voices refusing to be silenced. Later that evening, Ophelia joined Marcus in the waiting car. The ride home was quiet, the hum of the city fading into the background as she reflected on the day. When they stopped at a red light, she glanced out the window and saw a young woman holding a sign that read, "We deserve better." The words struck a chord. They weren't just about the company or the protests. They were about everything she had fought for, everything she continued to fight for. The right to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. When she arrived home, the night was still. Ophelia stepped into her living room, where a photograph of her parents sat on the mantel. They had taught her resilience, taught her that the fight for justice was never over but always worth it. She stood there for a moment, the weight of the day pressing on her, but she felt no despair. Instead, she felt a quiet determination. The challenges she faced were daunting, but they were not insurmountable, and as long as she had the strength to stand, she would continue to push forward, not just for herself, but for everyone who came after her.